Welcome back. I'm Jeremy Szafron. What if I told you that the greatest threat to your financial future isn't a recession, a war, or even inflation? It's the government's money printer. Now, this week, the U.S. House advanced a sweeping tax and spending bill backed by President Trump that's projected to add nearly $4 trillion to the federal deficit. That's on top of the ballooning war costs, record entitlement spending, and the highest peacetime debt load in U.S. history. Now, bond markets are already flashing red. The 30-year Treasury just topped 5.1%. It's the highest since October of 2023. And are investors dumping U.S. debt? That is the question. And are they doing it because they've lost trust, not just in the numbers, but in the system itself? Now, my next guest has warned for decades that reckless spending, endless wars, and the Fed money printing erode our freedom and our wallets. Tom DiLorenzo is one of the fiercest critics of central banking, statism, and the creeping expansion of government power. Now, he's the president of the Mises Institute, the author of over a dozen books, including The Problem with Socialism, and a leading authority on the economic and political consequences of abandoning sound money. Now, he calls the Federal Reserve a legalized counterfeiter, and he believes central bank planning is fundamentally immoral. Now, he says America's financial trajectory is not just reckless, it's an anti-constitutional. Today, we'll ask him whether the dollar system is reaching its breaking point and what sound money looks like in 2025. Tom, welcome to Kitco. Great for making the time. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Now, listen, we got lots to get into. You heard off the top, and I'm sure you've seen the news. This week, we saw the House advance that Trump-backed tax bill that the CBO says will add nearly about $4 trillion to the deficit. And as I mentioned, bond yields are spiking. The 30-year just broke through 5.1%. And investors are waking up to what Moody's warned about last week, that the U.S. is in deep fiscal trouble. So how does this moment validate the core thesis that you've been making for decades, that the central bank has enabled a government to grow beyond any constitutional limit by debasing the currency?
Well, yeah, we at the Mises Institute just produced a documentary called Playing with Fire, Money, Banking, of the Federal Reserve. You can get it on our website or on YouTube. And the reason we called it that, came from James Grant. He said the Fed is basically like an arsonist that sets house fires. And then once the fires are going, the arsonist changes into a firefighter's uniform and tries to put out the fires that he started by pouring more gasoline on them. And that's basically what the Fed has been doing for 113 years, all these years, since 1913. They create bubbles, boom and bust cycles, price inflation. And then when the stuff hits the fan, their only response is to do more of the same. And now that we've had over a century of this, I think people are finally starting to wake up to it. That's one of the reasons why we produced the documentary that has over 1 million views now, by the way, and it just came out in October of last year. And it's the same old story. The same old story with Washington. They can't control military spending. We have something like 800 bases around the world of some sort that we know of, and why? Mm-hmm. And the Fed makes that all possible. It began with World War I, after all. The U.S. probably could not even have entered World War I had it not been for the Fed financing a fourth to a third of it at the time, just a few years after the Fed was created.
Yeah, Tom, you've called, the Fed a legal counterfeiter. And I mean, that's a quote. I mean, our viewers that we talk about the Fed often, I think they kind of get it. But walk us through what you meant by that.
Yeah, well, if you and I did it, I guess as long as we called it monetary policy, we would stay out of jail.
Yeah,
but it's basically the same thing. The origin of the Fed was there was a campaign for decades by the bankers. The problem with the bankers is if you had a bank and you had very minimal reserves, gold and silver, and you overextended yourself in terms of loans, and there was a run on your bank, you would go bankrupt, as you should. And so competition disciplined bankers. Yeah, there were bad bankers. There were bankruptcies, but competition of that sort in terms of keeping a decent percentage of reserves in gold and silver worked very well. And bankers complained about that because they were limited in how many loans they could make. And so basically the government set up a cartel arrangement whereby the government called itself the lender of last resort, which is another way of saying we will bail out your bad loans, if you're threatened with bankruptcy. And so that all the banks could expand loans at the same time, even if you had 1% reserves or 99% reserves, you're okay. The Fed will take care of you. And so they tremendously expanded the amount of lending, and of course they made a lot of money doing that. And we were still attached to gold for a long time until Nixon came along in the early 70s, and finally took us off out of the gold window altogether. And it's not just an accident that the 70s was an economic wreck with stagflation that lasted, throughout the entire decade following Bretton Woods.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're seeing this record debt now, and we're seeing the money printing, of course, during COVID. There's a lot of question marks of what's to come. Talk to me about how this mechanism allows for what we're kind of seeing. I mean, this endless war, state surveillance, and even violations on the Constitution.
Even Adam Smith, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, as it's called, published in 1776, mentioned that if wars were financed by taxes rather than money printing, essentially by the Bank of England during his time, then you see fewer wars, and the ones that did exist would be shorter. And that's certainly true. And Ludwig von Mises said the same thing, the namesake of our organization. And printing money creates what economists call a fiscal illusion. That's sort of economics lingo for the perceived cost of government is lower because it induces people to think we can get something for nothing. If the U.S. government would announce that it's going to send an extra $100 billion to the Ukrainian oligarchs, and they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to send each working family a tax bill for $20,000 to pay for this. I think you'd see a lot fewer Ukrainian bumper stickers in your town, as far as that goes. And so that's basically legalized counterfeiting. The main tool that was developed in the 1930s through legislation was allowing the government to monetize the government debt by buying short-term government bonds. And they just print up the money, or at the time they printed it. It's all electronic now. And buy bonds. What a deal. You can create money out of thin air and buy bonds. And then the interest income on the bonds owned by the Fed is how they pay the Fed's salaries and perks and benefits and all that. So there's a built-in bureaucratic incentive for inflation to put more money in circulation because the Fed itself personally, the employees benefit from inflation.
Yeah, it's funny because obviously we're taught that the Fed exists to stabilize the economy, but it's kind of what you're talking about. I mean, it's created these repeated boom and bust cycles, 2008, 2020, and now a slow motion debt implosion, it seems like. Is this by design? It seems like it's not an accident here. I mean, some economists obviously argue we need a lender as a last resort, but are they wrong? Are they lying?
Well, that would be I could live with that, lender of last resort. But it's all the central planning that has been an utter failure. There's a huge literature on this in the field of economics, and I surveyed a good bit of it in my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics. And the literature shows us that the Fed, the U.S. economy has been more unstable after the Fed than before the Fed. We never had a perfect nirvana, a perfect utopia in terms of our monetary system. But the system under the Fed has been worse in terms of instability than it was before the Fed. And of course, it has utterly failed to control inflation. The dollar is worth maybe 2 cents of what it was in 1913, thanks to the inflation. The Fed now tells us that we all have to get at least a 2% pay cut every year in terms of 2% price inflation. And it's never just 2%. And that's a regressive tax. It harms lower income people more than higher income people. A 5% inflation, for 5 years in a row is not going to hurt Donald Trump very much. But the average working stiff will feel it, and then the price of groceries and everything else. And that's what so the Fed has failed in everything it is supposed to be doing, controlling inflation and and stabilizing the economy. And what a lot of people don't know, that it is a massive central planning organization. The Fed has a publication called, I think, the Structure of the Federal Reserve System. It publishes it every year. And it lists dozens and dozens of regulatory activities of the Fed. It regulates almost any kind of financial transaction that exists. I don't think the Soviet Union even had that much regulation of their economy as we get of our economy through the Fed. And so that's one of the things we hardly ever talk about. And central planning is not going to work because Americans are not smarter than the Russians were. They tried it for 70 years and it didn't really work out very well. There's no reason to believe that Americans are any better at it than the Russians were.
Hey, Tom, I got to ask you a little bit about this financial, or I guess fiscal insanity. I mean, this new tax bill, the Trump bill combines tax cuts and massive military spending, but the markets are already reacting. I mean, long duration yields are spiking. Explain what the long-term consequences of this kind of fiscal recklessness are.
Yeah, the long-term consequences. Well,
if you can.
That's, it is fiscal recklessness. As Trump comes in with all these promises and he hires Elon Musk to fire a few bureaucrats, and isn't it turning into sort of a smoke and mirrors game? I applaud a lot of the things Elon Musk has been doing in revealing all the fraud, waste, and everything else. But then the Congress has to act. The Congress has to get rid of the fraud and waste. And it's not fraud and waste to them. It's valuable vote buying for special interests to them. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just the Democrats who are complaining. There are a lot of Republicans, not all. I think Thomas Massey, for example, is the best we've got. He's sort of the new Ron Paul in the Congress. and I'm an old Ron Paul fan. In fact, I have an autographed picture of Ron in my office. I'm looking at it right now.
He's been on this show. We are too.
Yeah, and so it's the road to financial ruin to keep spending like this. But the key to it is everybody refuses to do anything about the military spending. Mm-hmm. We insist on being, pursuing being the world's guardian or the world's policeman, as they used to say, and in all these wars, never seem to have anything whatsoever to do with defending anyone or anything in America, and everything to do with making billions upon billions for the defense contracting industry, which they share, of course, with the Washington establishment. One of my op-ed articles that I wrote years ago was about a Washingtonian magazine cover story, and the title was "How Did We Ever Get So Rich?" We being the residents of the Washington, D.C. area. And then there's story after story of all the big mansions there and this politician or that politician who retired and got a good gig with Northrop Grumman for $5 million a year or something as a kickback. And that's the same old system. And President Trump was dead on in his first inaugural address when he looked at the Washington establishment right in the eyes. They were all sitting there. And he said, the government has benefited these people, but not you, you meaning the American public out there. And of course, after that, they spent the next decade doing everything, even trying to assassinate him for saying that. When he said that, there's this famous quote by Chuck Schumer to paraphrase it, that, the deep state can come at you, 10 ways from Sunday or something like that. Mm-hmm. And they did. They did everything they could to get rid of him. And I think that's the main reason. He spoke directly to the American people and said, the government is failing you. And why it's failing you is that it's only for the Washington establishment and their special interests. It's not about you at all. And that's why he got elected the second time, too, in my opinion.
All right, Tom, but we got to talk about this ongoing debt problem. I mean, where does it go from here? You've argued the deficits are just delayed taxation. I mean, is the government now engaged in a kind of intergenerational theft?
Well, yeah, it is all in every direction. Yeah. It's pursuit of zero interest rates for the past 30 years or something close to zero, means that the retired people have to take on a lot of more risk than they normally would if they want to earn any kind of return on their savings. And so there's sort of been a war on retirement savings, among other things, with the interest rate policy of the Fed. And by the way, one of the first things college students are taught when they take Econ 101 is that price controls are a bad idea. And here we have the Fed trying to control interest rates as its top priority always. The whole world waits with bated breath for the next announcement by the Fed chairman to try to guess what's going to do to interest rates. And why is that a good idea? Why is money the one thing that's legitimate? And of course, we got housing. There are a lot of young people that I'm sure you read about that they think they can never afford a house. Especially if you live in, coastal California or a lot of places on the East Coast where you read about, there were Florida, super expensive housing. And they're right about that. It's the result of decades of price inflation. And housing spikes more than most things when there's inflation because we have a huge stock of housing. So even if there's a house building boom, it only can increase the supply of houses by a tiny percentage year by year because we already have so many houses out there. And so in terms of supply and demand, the supply is relatively fixed. And so when you have a boost in demand fueled by cheap credit, the end result is a spike in housing prices. And we've had that decade after decade after decade now, thanks to the Fed. And that's why so many young people are in this position of where they either can't afford a house or they have to spend more than 50% of their monthly income to get into a house.
Yeah, and speaking of young people, I speak to many of them. It feels like people are starting to understand this idea of sound money because they obviously can't purchase what they used to be able to. I mean, Austrian British academic and philosopher Friedrich Hayek said, quote, "We shall never have a good money again before we take it out of the hands of the government." So is sound money a moral imperative? And if so, why?
It is because price inflation is an act of theft. It's even worse than normal theft because it's disguised theft. You don't even know it's happening to you. I mean, you don't even know it's theft, but you just go along and you live your life and you pay more year in and year out for the same things. And so that's if theft is moral, then price inflation caused by the central bank is immoral, and that's certainly true. And so, Hayek, one of his famous publications is on competing currencies. And he thought it would be a good idea to have competing currencies. And in today's world, that means cryptocurrencies as well as gold, silver, whatever the people choose to have as currency. And Hayek wrote this mail, 40 years ago, something like that. And he said, even if we had competing currencies, it wouldn't be that hard to calculate exchange rates, if we had to use, one currency being, traded for a different currency like you do when you travel overseas. And of course, the technology is orders of magnitude better now for doing that. You just pull out your cell phone in a few seconds, you can get that calculation, and that makes it work even more. And that's why at more and more of our Mises Institute events, we have a lot of young people from the Bitcoin world who are either students of it, investors of it. They're running their own businesses, and they're compared to me, they all look young, and that's a very exciting thing to me because they're reading Hayek and others Austrian school economists about this, and they're hungry to learn the economic underpinnings of their business or their investments in cryptocurrencies.
Interesting.
And that's been very noticeable in the last few years, especially.
I want to talk to you a little bit about your definition of what you consider sound money.
It has to be out of the hands of government, and it should be subjected to competition like everything else. And that's how gold, arose over the centuries to be the most preferred money. Through competition, there were all sorts of things used as money, coconuts, and all sorts of weird things in human history were used as money. Right. But, it's a unit of account, a store of value. and those are two of the most important things. And government government makes with the ups and downs of price inflation caused by central banking, it creates tremendous uncertainty, and so it's hard to say it's a good unit of account even, because what's the value of a dollar going to be 3 years from now, and we don't know. It depends on what the Fed does, and of course it gives the Fed all this power, and the Fed loves to have power. And the Fed bureaucrats love to walk around like economic gods. The late Murray Rothbard, who was the first academic vice president of the Mises Institute, had quite a sense of humor. And he once said that the average academic monetary economist would stab his mother to death with a fork for an invitation to a Fed conference. And so the Fed has a large army of propagandists for it, and in the academic world, which is why we don't hear too many criticisms of the Fed. I had an economics major who was a senior once in my teaching career. He took my course in American economic history, and he said, I've taken the whole curriculum on monetary economics, several courses, and this is the first time I heard that there were actually criticisms of the Fed in my class. And so that's how the academic economists are teaching their courses these days, for the most part. Of course, we have the Austrian economists, and we still have some solid Chicago school economists who don't teach like that. But it seems like the majority do.
I got to get back to that sound money conversation, just because gold, we've been talking about it here, all-time highs throughout last year, continuing a nice little run, but we're sitting here trading around $3,300 an ounce. So what is this telling you?
Well, it's telling you there's less and less confidence in the dollar, for sure. And you even have central banks buying gold in huge amounts. For that, they don't trust their own currencies. They want to have gold. And that's what it's telling you. And it's telling you that inflation is on the way too. Gold always spikes when inflationary expectations go up. And that's why we're seeing one of the reasons why we see higher interest rates over historically is that there's an inflation premium that lenders have to place on lending, and inflationary expectations are one of the reasons for that.
I want to get into Bitcoin. You brought it up there quickly, and we'll kind of unpack it a little bit, because I know you're moderating some interesting debates. But I guess the first question is Bitcoin sound money? We're seeing it hit a brand new record high above $111,000 today. It's been a rally kind of driven by institutional ownership and even corporate adoption. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's been so unstable that it doesn't really serve the store of value definition of money. It's a unit of account, the store of value, and the value could be cut in half tomorrow, and vice versa. And so that doesn't mean it will always be like that. I'm sure it took centuries for people to be comfortable with gold-backed currencies as being the main form of money, and so I think I'm kind of optimistic with the cryptocurrencies as being a more viable replacement for the dollar as we go. Just because it's unstable now doesn't mean it will always be unstable.
Interesting. You talked about talking to those younger generational folks. Obviously, some of our listeners and viewers love gold. Some love Bitcoin. We got to cover both here at Kitco. But the Mises Institute, you've hosted multiple debates on gold versus Bitcoin. What's your take here? Is Bitcoin a possible threat to the fiat regime, or just a passing phase? It sounds like you see it becoming more stable.
Yeah, it depends on whether or not the government would allow that to happen. The Fed has been around since 1913 because it allows politicians to play Santa Claus. They can promise the public something for nothing, as long as the public is sufficiently economically ignorant about the effects of the Fed and its price inflation and boom and bust and all that. That's why we're trying to educate the public. Murray Rothbard used to call it de-bamboozling, our educational efforts are an effort to counter the bamboozling of the public that the government does, and speak the truth about economic reality to as many people as we can. But I think the cryptos are going to prevail eventually. We had competing currencies before. I'm sitting here in Alabama, and the land of Dixie, and that came from in French. 10 is Dix, D-I-X, and 10. There was a bank in New Orleans called the Citizens Bank of Louisiana in the 19th century that had a very high percentage of gold reserves in its vaults. And its money, its currency, its paper currency, the Dix, was very well trusted, and it was used all over the country. People from the upper Midwest would come down the Mississippi River and sell their wares, their wheat or whatever they're selling, and they would go home and brag that they had a pocket full of Dixies because that's what they got in return for whatever it is they were selling there. And so people in Minnesota would be bragging about that. And that's how the South became known as the land of Dixie. The Dix was a currency. And then during the Civil War, though, when the government passed the National Currency Acts and the Legal Tender Acts, it put taxes on competing currencies. And that was the beginning of the end for all of these competing currencies like the Dix. And people got along very well with that. We had competition in currency, and the spawning of cryptocurrencies hopefully will do the same thing and break up the monopoly of government government money, the greenback dollar, that we've had since the American Civil War.
Yeah, well said. I'm curious. I mean, we've had Judy Shelton on the show. She's been talking about the gold cases. We've also talked about this whole conversation around Bitcoin reserves. Do you think both Bitcoin and gold can coexist in a sound money future, or do you think one will dominate?
Yeah, well, who knows? There was a debate, as you mentioned, several years ago at the Mises Institute on like two experts who are very knowledgeable about this, making the case. One made the case that cryptocurrency will prevail, and the other made the case that gold will prevail. The market will tell us. We shall see. No one can predict that, and so I certainly can't. But I think it's a good thing that if we do see competition, that's a good competition. Gold versus cryptocurrency versus. Forget about competition. The government will tell you what you're going to use for your money, but we need to let the market tell us, which is us. Basically, what we trust. After all, the only trust we have in our money is the promises of politicians. And what is that worth?
Yeah. Well, speaking of our money, you've called Lincoln's greenbacks, quote, monopoly money, right? You've argued that the Civil War was the original kind of federal power grab. I'm curious, let's pull it back a little bit. I mean, what should Americans understand about the monetary origins of this government overreach?
Well, one of the things they should understand is that Americans have abolished 3 central banks in our history. The first one was called the Bank of North America. It lasted about a year and a half. We're talking the late 1700s here. And its money was so worthless and untrustworthy that no one trusted it, and it was privatized. And then Alexander Hamilton championed something called the Bank of the United States, and that was given a 20-year charter, and it created boom and bust. It created price inflation, high unemployment for the first time ever in the young American Republic, and the Congress did not reissue the charter. This is in 1811, the year 1811. Then the War of 1812 comes. And that was used as an excuse to resurrect the bank. And it was called the Second Bank of the United States. And guess what? It created boom and bust cycles, corrupted politics, price inflation. And so Andrew Jackson, when he was president, famously vetoed the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States. This is in the 1830s. So we have a history of abolishing 3 banks. 3 central banks that were precursors of the Fed. But, the banking industry and other people that are related to it, they're the ones who profited from all this corruption and all the mayhem created. Governments like creating crises because a good crisis always benefits the government. Governments always take more power, more taxes, more debt, more regulation, more abolition of civil liberty whenever there's a crisis. And so it's a win-win when the central bank creates an economic crisis because the bankers and their friends make big bucks, and the government has another excuse to create more tyranny and more power for themselves. Yeah. That's the way they see it. And so that's why it's central banking is evil and immoral, and but the whole world has it because the politicians benefit from it. We went for a long time without the central bank, and there are some big economic treatises that were written that have concluded. One is by Richard Timberlake, who taught monetary economics at the University of Georgia for many years. And he made a very solid case that the monetary system that Americans had, basically from the 1840s until the Fed was created, no central bank until the Fed was created in 1913, was arguably the most stable monetary system we've ever had in American history. And it wasn't perfect. Yes, there were bankruptcies and there were ups and downs in the economy, but compared to what? Compared to the system with the Fed, which was much worse.
Talk a little, but it almost feels like the government obviously continues to get bigger too. I mean, you're talking from that to FDR's gold confiscation, Nixon closing the gold window. Has every expansion of government power followed monetary manipulation?
Well, monetary manipulation has always fueled the governmental power, especially war. It reduces the perceived cost to Americans of war. And so it makes war more likely, and it makes war more likely to be longer lasting. And that's the biggest disaster in terms of government programs. And war is a government program, after all. And, when's the last time we had a genuinely defensive war? Was it World War II? That's pretty much about it. And yet we've had war after war after war ever since then, and before then, for that matter. And so it's not just war. The Fed is every politician's dream at the federal level because, as I said, it's legalized counterfeiting, and they can play Santa Claus.
Doctor, is it fair to say that, without control of the money supply, that the federal government simply couldn't have grown this big?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we never would have gotten into World War I if it not were the Fed financing it. And if that happened, there may have never been a World War II. Mm-hmm. The European powers may have settled their disputes on their own without our intervention. And there may not even have been a Bolshevik revolution. If you study history, you will. One of the things you might learn is that Woodrow Wilson paid the Russian Tsar, to enter World War I, and the Tsar did, and 400,000 Russians were killed in World War I. And then the Bolsheviks were the only political party in Russia at that time that was anti-war. They were against the war. Mm-hmm. And Lenin himself once said that our party was born of the war. And that's what he meant, that it was a revolt against all the death and destruction of the war. And it was Woodrow Wilson who paid the Tsar to get his country involved in the war. And so, this is not just a wild speculation. If we, the United States, had not gotten into World War I, there may have never been a World War II. And what more can you say about it than that, as far as the debacles created by a government monopoly and money printing?
Let's get back to the Fed for a quick second, because I found this quote really, really interesting. Quote, central banking is Marxist. I mean, that's what you told Robert Breedlove, pointing to plank number 5 of the 1848 Communist Manifesto, state control of credit and currency. Unpack this claim, if you will. I mean, what makes the Federal Reserve, in your view, a fundamentally collectivist institution?
Well, as I said earlier, if you look at all of the regulatory functions of the Fed. It really is a socialist central planning agency. And in recent years, there was a study of the political affiliations of the Fed. And the numbers were like the Board of Governors has a lot of employees. There are only, 9 governors, but they employ hundreds of people. And the ratio of Democrats to Republicans is something like 97 Democrats and 3 Republicans on the board, things like that. And so it's become another Washington, D.C. insider think tank, but with power to print money, and so it can do a lot of damage as far as that's concerned. Yeah. And yeah, it's true. Marx all the socialists, first and foremost, wanted to take over the banking system and to allocate capital in ways they want to allocate capital rather than using consumer sovereignty, which is what happened in the free market, to allocate capital. They would instruct businesses to produce goods and services that the people want. And politicians, not all politicians, but statist politicians have always resented that, and they think they should be in charge of telling us what we want. And that's the essence of government, isn't it? On the free market, if you produce something that people don't want, they won't buy it, and you better find something else to do or you're going to go bankrupt. But in government just says, here, you want this, pay for it, or else we will make you live like a dog in a cage. It's called going to prison for tax evasion. That's basically the essence of government finance. And the Fed doubles up on that. Yeah. It says, instead of risking having to imprison half the population because they don't want what we're giving them, we'll disguise the cost. And the Fed that's why the Fed is so important to government, is that it disguises the cost of government, but not if you understand economics. If the government commandeers $1 trillion worth of resources, that's $1 trillion worth of resources that the private sector cannot use. Mm-hmm. And it will create unemployment in the private sector when it does that. And so if you understand that little tidbit of economics, you won't be bamboozled by the Fed. But most people are. Yeah. Well said.
Okay, we got to stay on this theme because I made a couple of notes here. I mean, you already kind of mentioned this in the interview, but we'll unpack it a little bit. I mean, the United States has already abolished 3 central banks, right? The Bank of North America, the first and second banks of the United States. What would a real pathway look like for doing it again in the 2020s? I mean, what are the obstacles to ending the Fed, and how might that be overcome?
Well, the first thing they could do is repeal the law that was passed in the 1930s that allowed the Fed to purchase short-term government debt. That's how it monetizes the debts, so to speak, and creates price inflation by inserting money, electronic money, into the banking system. And the primarily the New York banks, the big investment banks, or the bond dealers who buy and sell the government bonds, they make out on it because they're the first ones to get their hands on this money. But then after the money creates price inflation, you and I see it through the multiplier effect that the prices have already gone up. So the money has lost a lot of its value by the time the ordinary people see it. And so just that would be one thing to do. And then allowing competition among cryptocurrency, gold, anything else, as a number of states are moving in this direction now. I could see in the future more and more states nullifying more and more of what government is doing. We're already seeing what you might call soft secession of people leaving these sort of the big government hellholes of New York City and Illinois and parts of California and going to Florida and Texas and South Carolina, places where there's a higher degree of economic freedom for you. But I think we'll see more states nullifying the governmental edicts, and they may even start nullifying the Fed by allowing competing currencies in the future.
Yeah, that would be an interesting one. Okay, well, then we'll talk about the end game here. I mean, what happens if we stay on this path? If we don't return to sound money or constitutional restraint, I mean, what happens? Is it currency collapse, political breakdown? Is it a civil conflict?
Yeah, there could be. The currency could collapse. No one can predict, when that might happen. Mm-hmm. We're not in the same boat as we were in the 1930s. We've got such a tremendous infrastructure, including an intellectual infrastructure of our economy now that it's a different world altogether. And so, we're not going to see another Great Depression, although we could see a very severe depression. The crash of 2008 was not pleasant for a lot of people. And we got a taste of what could happen, I guess, during COVID when the government purposely shut down the economy and created 50% inflation. And I think that's a warning, though, of what could happen if the dollar does begin to crash. The government will dream up some sort of excuse to take from martial law of some kind, which basically it did during COVID. You probably read the stories of a dozen people getting together at someone's house to pray on Sunday or on the Jewish Sabbath or whatever, and the police showing up, knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, there's too many people in your house." It's if they can do that, they can do just about anything to you.
Yeah, and if we do succeed in ending the Fed, restoring competition in currency, what kind of society is possible?
Will be a much freer society, a much more stable society, much more trustworthy society. People would trust their currency, and also people will have learned of the decadence and corruption, inherent decadence and corruption of government, and that's always good. When Thomas Jefferson and the Jeffersonians were basically in power until the Civil War, really, it dominated. The Jeffersonian tradition dominated, didn't monopolize, but it dominated government. You had old Thomas Jefferson saying things like the tree of liberty must shed the blood of patriots and tyrants every 20 years. And people were pretty much saying, "Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I agree with that." And so they were probably better educated than the majority of Americans today about what government is really like. Maybe it's because they didn't have television back then. I don't know. There were probably a lot of reasons.
I got to ask you on this topic. I mean, if the political system won't rein in spending, what would actually force a return to fiscal sanity? I mean, would it take a currency crisis, maybe a failed Treasury auction, maybe a foreign buyer dumping U.S. debt like we're hearing about?
Yeah. Well, if we jab at the Chinese enough and they start unloading their government bonds, that'll create hyperinflation and wreck our economy pretty well. Mm-hmm. So it's dangerous business for President Trump to be antagonizing the Chinese like this. And of course, the neoconservatives, that's their main thing. They're just dying to have a war with China or Russia, which is insane, but that's the neocons. That's who they are. And they've been in power. They're not as powerful as they used to be, but they're still there. Trump fired one recently because he found that he was trying to sabotage something that President Trump wanted to do. So they're still there. They're like rats that you can't get rid of on an old ship. Mm-hmm. The neoconservatives, and they want World War III.
I got to ask you, Tom, I mean, talking about this conversation, we've been talking a lot about sound money. What would trigger a fix? I mean, is it going back to the gold standard? Some critics say returning is impractical. I mean, what kind of reforms would be needed? Audit the Fed, state-level gold tender laws? I mean, what's going to realistically advance sound money?
Well, I think, we still do have remnants of federalism in the United States. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea of federalism was that there'd be competition between localities, between states or localities on how to run government, what to do, how much freedom should we have, how much economic freedom and civil freedom should we have. And so I think in the future we could see a state or states seceding, and you could have a situation like that where they could have their own monetary system, a brand new monetary system, not tied to Washington, D.C. We always are talking in terms of left and right on politics, but we can talk about up and down too. The decentralization of governmental power is something that needs to happen. If that happens in the future, then that's where you could see good things happening. Because if a new state was created and had an honest currency and competing currencies, and it ended up succeeding more than all the ones around them, what do you think is going to happen? Some politicians like 1,000 Ron Pauls might sprout up and make an articulate case for let's be like them. Let's get rid of the central bank and have honest money again. And that's how competition would work. And once that got started, that's kind of what happened in the Soviet Union. Everybody thought it was inevitable; it'd be there forever. But when Gorbachev gave up on it, I just read recently that the per capita GDP of Poland is about to become greater than the per capita GDP of Japan.
Wow.
And who would ever have guessed that 35 years ago?
Yeah. You're talking about Ron. I know you're a busy man. You got lots to get to. But before we let you go, you're talking about that next generation. And I have to ask you, because you've helped distribute over 100,000 free copies of the book, What Has Government Done to Our Money, and other Austrian classics. I mean, where are you seeing the most momentum today, especially among younger Americans? Is the message actually resonating with Gen Z?
Yeah, it is. I've been really encouraging. We gave away 100,000 copies of that book. And we got another donor came to us, and he liked the idea so much, he gave us enough money to we're going to start giving away 100,000 copies of a new book about Hayek. It's called Hayek for the 21st Century, and it'll be out in about a month, and it'll be on our website, Mises.org. But recently, I mentioned that we had a lot of young people, young meaning 20s and 30s, coming to our events who are associated one way or another with Bitcoin. And they ran across Ron Paul, and they ran across Austrian economics, and they see the relationship. They probably read Hayek's little book on competing currencies, and they're really interested. And I just got back a couple of weeks ago from an invited talk at the University of Chicago. There's a conservative student group there. There's another one at Villanova University that cropped up. They just invited us to go there, talk about the similar topics. And this wasn't happening like this just a couple of years ago, where we get students at prestigious universities. And I think what's happening is there are a lot of people with money who are alumni, and they see the rot and the miseducation in the university system. And they're not just blindly throwing money at their alma mater. They're giving money to groups like this, like the student group at the University of Chicago, who want to educate themselves on the sort of things we're talking about, and then get out in the world and do something about it. And that is something that's going on right now that I see in my world, in my world of economic education. Yeah,
great to hear. Keep up the good work. Tom DiLorenzo, of course, is the president of the Mises Institute. He's also the author of over a dozen books. Thanks for this, Tom. Make sure you go and check out that documentary, too, if you're watching this. It's pretty fascinating. Thanks again for making the time for us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Now, if you found this conversation thought-provoking, or if it even challenged some of what you've been told, be sure to share it. These are the kinds of discussions that don't always make it into the mainstream, but they do matter. And for more interviews like this, deep dives into markets, money, and the forces shaping our economy, make sure to subscribe right here to Kitco News. I'm Jeremy Szafron. Thanks for watching.